All right, the Black Phone 2 has arrived. How does it compare to the first one? So earlier this afternoon, I went to go see The Black Phone 2. When I heard it was coming out, I was a little not sure how they were going to pull that off. I did not watch the trailers, but I did gather enough about them to realize that where they were going with this was that the grabber, he's dead now, but like his victims in the first movie, he's now in the supernatural realm and his powers can transfer into the real world in various ways. So that was kind of an interesting scenario. And I went into it, a little concerned that it might not compare favorably to the first one. And I'll just get this right out in the open that I thought it was pretty good. I enjoyed it. I don't really have any major cons to speak of about it. I didn't walk away from this movie feeling disappointed in how it was carried out. I do feel that the first one is better. That might largely be because those characters and their world was new and fresh to us. And so because of that, it's kind of impossible to recapture that uniqueness and that newness that we had from the first movie. So it's not really a fault of this film, but that's just kind of how I felt in general. However, I'm just very glad that I didn't walk away from it feeling profoundly annoyed or angry or feeling like it had gotten so far off the rails it was ridiculous. That was not my experience at all. Anyway, let me talk a little bit about the story. It starts off in 1957 in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. I guess I had forgotten that the first movie takes place in Colorado because that's an important fact. And a girl is talking on a phone booth at this youth camp. And that sets up the mystery, which is revealed little by little as the story goes on. Then we pick up with our main characters in 1982. So they're older now and they're obviously, later in their teen years. Maybe they're in high school at this point. They are both still very much haunted by the events that took place in the first movie, especially Finn, who doesn't seem to be handling it very well. And I mentioned in my out of the theater reaction that it kind of reminded me of how they handled Laurie Strode's trauma in Halloween 2018. It was very clear she was not dealing with it well and hadn't for decades. Very similar sort of situation with him. Not that he was completely crazy and wild, but he just was not managing his emotions well. And the younger sister, she is having these very, intense dreams. So we know in the first movie that she was gifted. She has these dreams and they tell her things. Well, either the events of the first movie have amplified that gift or her age, getting older, has amplified the gift. So now they're just much more intense, and it starts to become apparent that things that happen to her in the dream world are affecting her in the natural world, in real life. And so that was something that reminded me of Nightmare on Elm Street, specifically Dream Warriors, because at some point, she's trying to navigate or figure out how to deal with events in the dream world. It was interesting. I liked how they did that. There's a lot that I liked about this movie. I liked the acting. Obviously, to me, it was as good as the first. I liked the brother-sister relationship, the closeness that they have. It was also kind of funny and sweet to see how he felt a little protective of her when there was this love interest that has now entered the scene, and the brother's protective and the father's protective. They had this pretty tormented relationship with their father. He had become an alcoholic after their mother died, and he had, was abusive in some ways, and now he's on the straight and narrow and trying to maintain that. And so they sort of have this fragile relationship. Well, fragile in the sense that it's better now, but still they all very much remember how bad the past had been. But there was a cute scene with the father and son watching the boyfriend get ready to take the girl off, and they're both like standing there, arms crossed, not happy. She said something like, I don't like the way he looks at her. That was funny. There were a few chuckles in the movie theater because there were some genuinely comedic moments of dialogue. A lot of it tied back to the same sort of comedy that we saw in the first one with the little girl and her foul mouth, and she still has a very foul mouth. She made me laugh. Those moments helped to alleviate the tension that was building because of the situation going on. I also liked a sweet moment that she had with her boyfriend there at the camp, and she's had a bad dream, and so she decided she wanted to get in the bed with him because she was scared, and they had this nice little conversation, and then the conclusion of that scene was a pretty funny moment that involved her brother, and that got a big chuckle out of the audience as well. Some other things I liked was the way dream sequences were filmed and also flashback scenes. It's very clear that this is not something that's happening in present day. It's very grainy, fuzzy, staticky, and the images are kind of, I don't want to say frantic, almost like shaky cam, but not in an obnoxious way. Kind of like, you know how sometimes when you're having a dream, it can be very distorted and the images are just kind of here and there, and it reminded me of the way dreams can sometimes feel like. And so I thought that was a really good technique that they used to demonstrate this and to mark a clear distinction between reality and a dream state. I also liked that we got a bit more of the history of the grabber. This in some ways felt pretty almost detective-y because the brother and sister are trying to investigate stuff. There are also connections that involve their mother, and we find out more of her backstory, and we find out more information about just her and what happened to her, which is alluded to or talked about a little bit in the first one. I said in my out of the theater reaction that I'm not quite sure how I felt about some of that stuff, how just really interconnected and in-depth some of these plot points got, but it didn't necessarily mean that I disliked them, but I just wasn't sure if it was something that I really loved or if it felt like it was a bit of a thin sort of plot device used to create this bigger, extravagant story. I feel like I'm leaning a little bit more in the middle towards the positive as opposed to the latter, what I just mentioned. Maybe you'll know what I'm talking about whenever you check it out, if you do check it out. Another thing that I liked, which I touched on in my out of the theater reaction, was the appearance of Demián Bichir. He's a Mexican actor who I am very familiar with, and I had not realized he was going to be in this movie because, like I said, I didn't see any of the trailers. So I saw his name pop up, and that was kind of cool to see. And I liked his performance in here. I thought he did a really good job. I liked the setting as well because it took place at this camp for the most part, because it starts off back at their home, but then they eventually go to this camp because they start to put together connections between certain parts of this mystery and the camp, and they realize that the answers are there at the camp. Something that was reminiscent of was, you know, those camp slasher horror flicks from the 80s. I thought that was kind of an interesting touch, especially since this takes place in the early 80s. So, you know, there's just, for me, there's a lot to like about this film. If I had any sort of cons to say about it, besides just touching on what I already mentioned, which is kind of unfair to call it a con, is just, you know, it's not fresh and new anymore. We're used to these characters. We're used to this world. We're used to the whole supernatural element of the dead people talking through the phone. The cons that I have are pretty minor. One is, this is a super minor nitpick, but I don't understand how they were able to leave for this camp and say they were going to be gone for a few weeks when it was still in the middle of or towards the end of winter and they were still in school. Unless it was a long ass spring break and they did things differently in that state with spring breaks than they did when I was coming up in school, because number one, we never really got a spring break. So I don't know. Whatever. Like I said, that's minor. There was another thing that kind of jumped out to me as a potential kind of oh, I don't know about that. But this also might be unfair. There is a moment where it's revealed who a person is and their past. And what I don't understand is how this never became apparent or something that was known by this other group of people. But then I said to myself, well, this is a story that's taking place late 70s, early 80s. It's a little easier to hide true identities. You didn't have the digital footprint that you have now. So that also is probably unfair to call it a con. The closest I could probably come to a significant about this film is there's a scene that happens. It's not the very last scene, but it's like next to last or something. And there's a conversation that is had on the phone with someone that seems to break the rules of the world that we've been given as far as the supernatural realm and the communication device. I don't want to give anything away, so I'm not going to say what it is, but when you see this scene, you might pick up on what I'm trying to refer to. However, all of this stuff I have listed, as I've said repeatedly, it's very minor. I still thought this was a pretty solid sequel. I hope they don't make another one because I honestly don't know where they can go from here, because that whole storyline is now, it's pretty much done. And I don't want them to be resurrecting characters just for the sake of a sequel. That will really degrade the quality of this series. I want that to stay in the positive territory. So no more sequels, please. I hope it does well. I think it deserves to be watched on the big screen. But if you don't watch it on the big screen, if you watch it when it comes to streaming, hopefully you will enjoy it as well. Anyway, at this point, I have nothing more to say about The Black Phone 2. If and when you guys decide to check it out, let me know what you think. All right. Bye.